Good evening and welcome to this BERA webinar series focusing on contemporary curriculum debates in early childhood education. My name's Louise Kay and I'm the convener of the Early Childhood Education and Care SIG alongside Dr. Nikki Fairchild. This is the first of 3 webinars which we hope will provoke discussion and debate about the purpose of curriculum in the early years, especially in light of the recent early years foundation stage reforms. As part of this webinar series, we invite you to consider how curriculum drives pedagogy and practice, and to reflect on the role of practitioners in this process. We hope that you've had an opportunity to read the chapters we shared from the recent book by Claire Cameron and Peter Moss, entitled Transforming Early Childhood in England. It's free to download if you haven't already done so. Further details can be found on the event flyer. We did ask you to look at chapters 1 and 4 and thinking about what is the purpose of early childhood education, but you might also be interested in chapter 7, which is focuses specifically on curriculum in early years. I think Nathan refers to that chapter in his presentation next week. This evening we're listening to Dr. Liz Chesworth from the University of Sheffield, who will be presenting her work on children's interests and curriculum decision making. Next week, Dr. Nathan Archer will focus on agency and activism in the early years sector. And in the final week, Nancy Stewart will join us to talk about the recent publication of the Birth to 5 Matters framework. Just a quick point about the format of the session this evening. Liz is going to do her presentation, which will last about 30 minutes, and you will have the opportunity to ask questions as she's presenting using the Slido app, which hopefully you'll have downloaded onto your phones. And at the end of the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session, and I'll pose the questions to Liz that have been asked during the session, the presentation, and also as part of the Q&A session as well. It's now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Liz Chesworth. Liz's current work focuses on how curriculum in early childhood can draw upon children's everyday lives at home, including their engagement in digital worlds, as rich sources of knowledge and skills. She's currently the principal investigator for a research project funded by the Froebel Trust, and will be sharing some of her work from that project with you this evening. Thank you, Liz. I'd like to now hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Louise, for that introduction, and hello to everyone. I'd just like to start with saying thank you so much to Louise and also to Nikki for the invitation to join you this evening and to talk about some of my ideas about curriculum in early childhood. And obviously thanks also to the brilliant organisers at BERA who have set everything up so efficiently, and I'm told now that if I click, my slides will magically be able to move. So let's see. Yes. Oh, that was I had a moment of fear then, but yes, everything works perfectly. So yeah, really great to be in this space, albeit a virtual space, with a group of like-minded people who share an interest in the learning of our very youngest citizens. This evening, I'm going to be talking about my research based on children's interests. And as Louise has said, I've got a particular interest in thinking about how those interests are connected with, situated within children's diverse local communities and family lives. So I'll be talking about some of the work I've done around that and thinking about how children's interests can connect with the early childhood curriculum. Indeed, we could actually think of them as curriculum in their own right. Linked with that, I'm going to be inviting us to think about some of those bigger questions that I guess will be revisited throughout this seminar series around who, how and why makes the decisions around curriculum for young children. And within the seminar, I'll be highlighting some tensions and what I've called here some knotty issues And I'm afraid, which is always really frustrating, isn't it? I'm afraid I obviously haven't got any clear-cut solutions for some of these knotty issues, but I'm hoping that they maybe will be a provocation, a stimulus for questions and dialogue between us, both tonight and into the future. And I'm going to finish the presentation by arguing that a democratic curriculum needs to be a dynamic curriculum. And something that I've been thinking about a lot over the last few weeks is how absolutely central to that notion of a dynamic curriculum is the idea of observation. And I've got some concerns about observation within the changes that are happening at the moment within the English system that I'll briefly talk about. So I'll be talking about this idea of the need to reclaim observation as a core practice in early childhood education. So every now and again I will have to look down because I've got my phone here to make sure that I don't run over too much, so that there's still going to be an opportunity for questions. Okay, I'll move on. Now, I'm afraid that the first two slides are really self-indulgent because they both include photographs of me when I was obviously much, much, much younger. But I do promise you that this presentation isn't about me. It just kind of made sense to have a couple of photos of me where I could give myself permission to share these images without worrying too much. And this first photograph, which I think I've seen from the list that there's some of people that have studied with me at Sheffield, or maybe are current students, and you will probably be absolutely sick of seeing this photo, so I do apologise. But this is me when I was a little girl, about 4 years old, I think I was, and at the time I lived with my family near a park in Kent that some of you might know of, called Knowle Park. And the really amazing thing about Knowle Park was there was a herd of wild or maybe semi-wild deer that lived in that park. You might actually be able to see them. They're sort of like a fuzzy mass just at the bottom of the tree line on the right-hand side of the photograph. And you might be able to guess that what I liked to do when I went to that park, which was a weekly occurrence, nearly every Sunday afternoon with my family, was to dress up in the clothes that I thought made me look really like a deer, maybe not that convincing now looking back on it, and find the most antler-like twigs to attach to my head. And me and my younger sister used to have great fun sort of seeing how close we could get to the deer and thinking about, you know, maybe they might even mistake us for one of them, which of course they never did. Now, the really important message, I guess, the key point behind that little rather indulgent reminiscence is that as a result of these weekly visits to the park, I developed a really keen interest in wild animals. Initially the deer at the park, but that interest developed into a much broader interest in nature, in ecology, in wildlife, that actually has stayed with me now. It informed the degree I did at university, and is still something that is a big part of my life. The point that I want to make about this is that I would argue that the way that I conceptualize interest is that interest didn't just develop in a vacuum. It didn't develop in isolation. It developed in relation to the cultural practices, the social and cultural practices that were part of my home life. This was the part where my dad had proposed to my mum, and we always used to go and see the tree where she'd said yes. In fact, me and my sister used to get totally bored of it by the time we were a little bit older. But the deer were a big part, of course, of that interest as well. So the interest that I developed was situated within and also mediated by the social, cultural and material contexts that I was growing up in. So in other words, when we think about interest from this particular perspective, it's really important that we think about them in terms of children's relations, their relationships and their interactions with the people that are important in their lives and the places and the associated social and cultural practices. Gosh, this is another indulgent photograph, but I promise you this is the last one. This is really just to illustrate some points to lead us into the main part of the session. When I was a little girl, my dad was training to be an architect, and he couldn't afford to go to university full time, so he worked in the day, and he used to go up to London to study at night school in the evenings. And one of my earliest memories is at the weekends, my dad having a drawing board in the corner of our living room. And one of my first presents that I was bought was an easel. I don't think I drew that picture. That head looks far too circular for someone of 2 years old. But the key thing is that I learned to develop an interest in mark making by observing, and what Barbara Rogoff, I guess, would say, observing and pitching in, watching what my dad did and imitating that and making sense of it. So young children's interests, I think, are often a way of making connections with the people, places and practices that are important to them. And as a result, they can enable children to make sense of the world around them. The links between curriculum then is that noticing, recognising and valuing children's interests can enable practitioners to develop meaningful or potentially meaningful context for learning that has meaning but also has purpose for children. So interests are diverse because social, cultural and material contexts are diverse. They're dynamic, they change and evolve all the time as the context that children are living in change and evolve. And I'm going to be arguing that they're really important concepts for us to think about when we think about the early childhood curriculum. So the next part of the session then is really thinking about how children's interests can connect with approaches to early years curriculum. And in order to do that, I think we need to take a step back and think about some of these much broader questions around curriculum decision making in terms of who is it that makes those decisions about curriculum? Where does curriculum making happen? Does it happen in, national government policy offices? Or does it happen within early childhood settings? Does it happen within families? Maybe it happens in all of those places. What's the purpose of those curriculum making decisions? And really importantly, these final two questions are the questions I think that really drive and motivate my interest in this particular topic and my research in this area. So who and what do those decisions privilege, and who and what might be excluded or marginalised through those decisions? So we promised you a bit of audience interaction, and this is your chance. So I'm going to be handing over to you now. It's going to be like magic. I'm not quite sure how it will work, but I've been told I need to be patient because it takes a little while for your responses to show. But I'm going to invite all of you to spend a couple of seconds, or maybe a little bit more than a couple of seconds, reflecting on who should be involved in curriculum decision making, okay? Now, do I need to move on to the next slide, Met, to be able to see the response? Okay, great. Okay, so you should now be able to see a screen where you can actually share your perspectives on who you think should be involved in curriculum decision making. And obviously we're thinking about that in the context of early childhood education. So I'll shut up now and give you a chance to think. It gives me a chance to have a glug of my water as well. Gosh, it is like magic. Okay, so I'm guessing that with these amazing word clouds, we tend to get the words where the size of the words reflects the responses, doesn't it? So it looks like we've got some kindred spirits in this room, in that lots of people seem to be suggesting that children should play an active role, which leads beautifully into the rest of the session. But there's also some really important and other people perhaps, that you're saying should also be involved. It's interesting, this word experts, isn't it? Because I wonder what we mean by experts, and perhaps lots of different people have got different sorts of expertise that can feed into that process. So expertise in terms of local community practices, expertise in terms of a particular child or children, expertise in terms of, you know, curriculum development more broadly. So that's great. Gosh, this works really, really well, doesn't it? I don't know why I'm sounding so surprised. I'm such a control freak that if I haven't organised it myself, I'm always a bit worried. But it's fantastic. Thank you for this. I'm not quite sure when we finished, but it looks like probably most people have inputted in. So we've got some interesting words coming up as key words there, haven't we? Children, practitioners and teachers, parents, everyone, researchers. That's an interesting take as well, isn't it? And I like this idea of community, communities. We've got a lot of words relating to family, to parents, parents, children, practitioners. So that's great. Thank you for that. And that leads on really nicely, I think, into the next part of the session then. So I'm arguing in this seminar that we need to move away from this word delivering curriculum that implies really that children are all sort of sat there like baby birds with their beaks open in a nest waiting to be fed curriculum, to moving towards a far more dynamic process of curriculum in which all those people that you have just identified as a group can potentially play an active role. And I want to introduce, well, not introduce, I'm sure that for many of you these are familiar already, but I want to tell you about 3 related concepts that I've used in my research to help me to think about this idea of moving from a delivery model of curriculum to a far more active, democratic and responsive approach that builds upon children's interests. And my work really resonates and builds on the work of Helen Hedges in New Zealand. Helen Hedges talks about an inquiry-based approach to curriculum, which is really what we're talking about here. And that begins, says Helen Hedges, with practitioners noticing, valuing and building on the real questions that children are exploring in their play and in their explorations. And I've drawn upon Helen Hedges' work to use the concepts, funds of knowledge, funds of identity and working theories to help me to work with practitioners to notice those real questions and to tune into the things that are really important to children in relation to their interests. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes just speaking very quickly about each of those concepts. As I say, I'm sure that many of you are already familiar with at least some of them. So funds of knowledge originates from research by educational anthropologists in the United States who were interested in sort of inequity in education for older students, actually. And the concept of funds of knowledge is about working with teachers, so teachers, children and families working together to recognise and identify children's everyday knowledge and ways of knowing. So funds of knowledge is much broader than knowledge in its most literal sense. So the everyday knowledge, the values, the skills, the ways of knowing that children construct through their active participation in family and community life. And that everyday knowledge is often central to the interests and the inquiries that children bring from home into schools and settings. Linked to that, a more recent concept is the concept of funds of identity that really, as the name suggests, recognises that this participation in everyday life is an important sense of children's developing sense of self, their sense of who they are, their identity. So in other words, from this perspective, identity is constructed in relation to social, cultural and material contexts. And Helen Hedges has written a really interesting paper about this recently, the references at the end of this slide, where she has taken the concept of funds of identity and is arguing that it is really important for early childhood practitioners to think about this in relation to how identity is constructed, in relation to children playing an active role in that process. And of course, funds of identity, when we're thinking about curriculum, is also really important in terms of fostering that sense of belonging and inclusiveness for children in early years settings. So the final concept is working theories, a concept originally developed by Guy Claxton here in the UK and Margaret Carr in New Zealand. And working theories are really about how children connect experiences. So they connect what they already know and can do with new experiences that they encounter. And through that, deepening their understanding through thinking, pondering, wondering, making sense of the world. So taken together, I think that these three concepts that are interrelated offer a really helpful way of theorising children's interests. And they offer a conceptual lens when they're combined for recognising children as active contributors to curriculum making, that all of us, I think, have probably agreed with that, judging by the activity before. It also enables us to foreground respect for children's everyday lives as rich contexts for curriculum making. And in terms of that curriculum making process, that can then enable practitioners to plan a curriculum that is responsive to children's diverse life worlds, their life experiences. And I want to spend the next part of the session just talking a little bit about a research project funded by the Froebel Trust, where we were exploring that very idea of curriculum decision making in relation to children's interests using those three concepts. So it took place in a community children's centre in Sheffield, a really super diverse, very dynamic urban locality. And just to illustrate that, in the preschool room, there were 32 children on roll in the preschool room where we focused the research. And between those 32 children, they spoke 25 languages, which is quite impressive, isn't it? So it was an ethnographic study. My lovely former colleague, Dr. Aderonke Foloronsho, was the main field worker. So she spent between 3 to 4 days every week over a 3-month period, really just working as a practitioner really in that preschool room. And I did weekly visits as well. So we focused on 10 children who were aged 3 and 4 years old. And the focus of the study was working alongside the children, the practitioners, and the families to firstly recognise children's interests through those really familiar practices of documentation, observations, photographs, artefacts, using that documentation to try to get a deeper understanding of how children's interests connected with their everyday lives. So we did that through conversations with children, reflective dialogues, where we used the documentation to reflect on children's interests with caregivers and with practitioners. And also that the final aim of the research was to think with practitioners about how those interests could be extended to lead to deeper understandings for children. And again, the methods that we use for that were reflective dialogues with practitioners and curriculum documentation. So the findings of that research indicate that for those particular children, the ways in which we could recognise and respect children's interests required us really to focus on this idea of multimodality. So children, in other words, didn't always express those real questions that they were wanting to investigate through words, although of course they sometimes did. But it was really important for us to tune into those multiple modes that children use to communicate and make meaning. So movement, gesture, play, using resources, all of those things. And equally important was sometimes we didn't realise the significance of what we had observed until we shared those observations with practitioners, with children, and with families. So 2 really important points coming out of that the process of recognising children's interest requires a recognition of multimodality and also a recognition of the importance of respectful 2-way dialogue and relationships. And for those children, we found that the children's interests were constructed from an interweaving of their participation in family practices, so a lot of interest relating to helping with food preparation, caring for siblings, hobbies, sometimes the children's own hobbies, but sometimes watching the parents' hobbies and pastimes, a bit like me watching my dad, I guess, when he was learning to be an architect. And also religious practices were for some children a big part of their interests. Engagement with literature and popular culture, so there were a lot of instances of children playing with ideas that came from their interest in television characters, YouTube vlogs, films, all those sorts of things. And obviously key to that was their relations and their relationships with people, places and materials. Now, this research took place way before the lockdown period, but even then, it was important for children to interact with to develop their interest in online digital spaces as well as in physical spaces. And I guess it would be really interesting, wouldn't it? We're doing a little bit more data generation for this project in the summer term in a school in Greenwich, and it will be interesting to see how that particular aspect has shifted over the last 12 months. So the research illuminated really diverse instances of children's curriculum making with family, friends and practitioners. And I think it's important to say that this is an area of Sheffield that is often labelled as a so-called problem area, as a disadvantaged area where educational achievement is highlighted as problematic. So this is kind of a counter argument where we're seeing that actually there's all sorts of richness of learning that is taking place within this particular community. However, and I think this is our first tension really, the early years foundation stage emphasises this more standardised conceptualisation of knowledge, where those predetermined learning outcomes, the early learning outcomes, are assumed to have universal relevance for all children. And although the early learning goals have never been intended to be a curriculum, because we're working in a system that, maybe this will change, but we're working in a system that is so data driven, the practitioners really felt under quite a lot of pressure for their curriculum to be dictated by the gaps in their data rather than by the children's interests. And you can see that is reflected in what this practitioner is saying here. You know, she's sort of thinking about, you know, is it the statements that children have and haven't met that is driving our decision making and our responses to children rather than the things that they're interested in? We can see Ofsted creeping in here as well. So some of those tensions and knotty issues then is we've got this standardised curriculum whereby the early learning goals have become the curriculum. They were never intended to be the curriculum, but that in effect is often what they have become. And linked to that, this really powerful narrative of a data-driven accountability culture. And that has led to this, to observation being used primarily as a tool for monitoring, rather than as a tool for tuning in and understanding and respecting the things that are important for children. So this is one knotty issue. Those first 2 points, I think, are closely related. The other one, of course, is that practitioners don't observe and notice children's interests in a vacuum. They notice and respond to children's interest in relation to their own funds of knowledge and their own funds of identity. And of course, that has an influence on all sorts of things. Way back in the 90s, Angela Ranning wrote a really important paper, I think, where she was kind of critiquing the interests-based curriculum in early childhood and saying, but actually in reality, an interest-based curriculum is is a white female middle class curriculum. So in other words, the then predominant workforce responded to and noticed the interests that resonated with their own experiences. So whereas an interest-based curriculum in principle sounds very inclusive, Angela Anning was arguing that actually when you dig a little bit deeper, it's not quite as inclusive as it sounds. And I think similar issues were found in our research. So I want to illustrate this with just two quick examples. This is Aneni, who's one of the children in the research. We've changed the children's names. Now, Aneni was one of those children that we've all encountered, I'm sure, that was a dinosaur expert. He knew far more at the age of 3 about dinosaurs than I will ever know. His play reflected his interest in dinosaurs. He chose books related to dinosaurs. He drew pictures like this one here relating to dinosaurs. And when we shared the documentation with Aneni's mum, she said, well, yes, this interest is something that comes from home. It started when he watched the National Geographic channel with his dad, so it's a shared interest. And in response, the family have responded to that interest and extended it, for example, by buying books about dinosaurs. Here's another interest. This is Elian, who was 4 years old. And Elian had a really big interest in fighting, in play fighting. So often we observed him using small animals to make scenarios where the animals were fighting. He was often involved, particularly outside, with play fighting with his friends. And he often talked about and included within his play storylines and characters relating to his favourite films. And again, when we shared these observations with Elian's family, it became clear that this interest was closely associated with his relationship with his dad. So interestingly, I've chosen both these examples because they're very different interests, but they both stem actually from a child's relationship with their father, sharing the National Geographic channel and being interested in boxing and play fighting for Elian. So thinking about what I was saying about Angela Anning, Angela Anning's work back in the 90s, we've got another interactive activity here. So I want to ask you, whose interests do you think are most likely to be built into the curriculum? Do you think practitioners found it easiest to respond to Aneni's interest in dinosaurs or Elian's interest in play fighting? So again, I think I just click onto the next slide. Okay, so I'll be quiet and allow you to vote. Gosh, that went up really quickly. Okay, I think that's probably everyone. I'm not sure, but we've got a clear winner here, haven't we? That Aneni's interest in dinosaurs. Some people thinking about the play fighting as well. The answer is that practitioners found it far more straightforward to respond to Aneni's interest. So they built a lovely project. So they responded in the moment to Aneni's interest, but they also enhanced the provision. They planned additional experiences to support that interest. Whereas for Elian, his interest in play fighting was suppressed to a big extent. You know, he was told, you know, we don't play like that in nursery. We don't fight here. If you're interested in that and you're not familiar with her work, Penny Holland's work from years ago is really interesting about that. But if we think about the concept of children's interest in relation to funds of identity and belonging, what does that do, I wonder, for Aneni and Elian's sense of feeling that they belong within this particular setting? Just raises some interesting issues that we haven't got time to think about in a great deal of depth now, I'm afraid. So returning to those knotty issues, my slides have done an interesting thing here. These are some things that we might want to think about at the end of the session. How should practitioners respond to interests that might conflict with their own values and beliefs? What about what Lou Zipping calls dark funds of knowledge. So funds of knowledge aren't all sort of like, you know, light and fluffy. The children have difficult experiences that they want to make meaning of as well. Some interests, knowledge and ways of knowing may be privileged over others. And is there enough time within the nursery day or the early childhood day for practitioners to really develop those close reciprocal relationships with families, to recognise those localised social cultural practices and how they contribute to children's interests? And is it indeed possible to build a curriculum that's got local relevance when we have a system within England at least that is so dictated by universal goals and outcomes? Okay, that's the rather negative bit that you might want to ponder over. This, I think, is a way forward. Ultimately, a curriculum that is based on children's interests and responding to children's real questions is an inquiry model of curriculum. So I really like this idea of building communities of inquiry that move us away from curriculum delivery towards this really dynamic approach to curriculum making. Sorry, that was my cat just hiccuping after having her tea. I might have to turf her out. You're right. Sorry, the trials and tribulations of doing a presentation from home. So we're moving away from this preset curriculum towards a curriculum that responds to children both in the here and now, but also I think it's really important to think about how those in the moment, those here and now encounters can connect together to enable children to make connections in their learning through their interests that lead to deeper understandings. So this dynamic curriculum might start with one child's interest, but it develops in uncertain directions as other children's interests sort of come on board as well. And within that dynamic curriculum, sometimes the children are the experts, sometimes the adults are the experts, and sometimes no one is the expert. That's sometimes the most exciting form of curriculum making, isn't it? When actually no one knows the answer, we need to find out more. And this requires us to recognise that learning progression isn't always linear, is it? It's far more complex than that. So a democratic and dynamic curriculum, I think, requires us to really think carefully about the central role that observation and linked to that pedagogical documentation has within that process of driving a dynamic curriculum. And I think that in early childhood, we need to reclaim observation. So Bernstein, way back in 2003, was critiquing early years practice and saying that play has become a tool for monitoring and screening, and observation is a surveillance device. And I think that still reflects the dominant way that observation has come to be seen. And what I'm encouraging us to think about is moving towards observation as a democratic process. So rather than using observation to tick off what children can and can't do and enter it into a database, observation should be, I think, about learning with children, about tuning into those real questions that are important to them and responding to them. So that dynamic curriculum is driven by observation, but as Froebel reminds us, observation without reflection is pointless, it's hollow observation. So we need to make sure that we're building reflection within that process as well, reflection between practitioners and also with children and families in order to provide those meaningful responses. And what I've argued in this session is that funds of knowledge, funds of identity and working theories offer a helpful lens to sort of fuel that process. Okay, so a democratic and dynamic curriculum is informed by deep knowledge of children's interests, enables practitioners, families and children to co-construct a curriculum which really importantly recognises and respects those diverse contexts in which children live and learn. So I'm just going to end with one of my early childhood heroines is Celia Ganeshi. And this is a quotation that's taken from a book she wrote with Aileen Goodwin. And she's writing it in relation to early childhood in the United States. back in 2008, but I think is highly relevant for what I've been talking about today, and is really what drives my work, I think. So I know it's very poor practice to read a quotation, but I'm going to demonstrate poor practice because I think it's really powerful. So they say children are only at risk of failing in school when curricula leave no room for their multiple interests and identities. And teachers, practitioners, are the ones who, alongside with their children, can push back to enlarge the stage where curricula and children's experiences within them are transformed. And it's on our small classroom stages where universal human rights, social justice can begin. So I'm going to end with that very powerful quotation and bring that back to what we're thinking about in this seminar series, and to think about how can early childhood connect with the diverse context in which children are living and learning, of which formal education is only a small part of that, isn't it? And what are the implications for the workforce in terms of professional development and identities? So thank you so much for listening. I hope it's been interesting. And I think I've maybe finished about a minute late, so apologies for that. You could probably notice I sped up towards the end. But yeah, thank you so much everyone for giving me the opportunity to talk about something that is so important to me.
Liz, thank you so much for sharing. I always love hearing your work, as you know, and your stories about the children in the nursery. And I was nodding away as you were presenting. We do share common interests in aspects of early childhood, I know. I do have a couple of questions, but I'm going to abuse my chair's privilege because there is one thing that I want to ask you. When the poll, the very first poll on who should be involved in curriculum decision making, there was quite a significant group of people that were not included, and they were policymakers, and obviously we exist in a particular policy landscape. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on the role of policymakers within curriculum decision making.
Oh, Louise, I thought you were going to give me an easy question to start with. Thanks, seriously, thank you for that, Louise. That's a really important question, isn't it? And I know that it's a question that that I've talked about with lots of people, in terms of, if we think about the diverse context in which early childhood is taking place around the world, I think actually that there is a place for policymakers within that. I think there is a place for policy in terms of thinking about some aspects of ensuring equity and quality. But I think what has happened within the English system is that policymakers have come to dominate that process. And of course, the agendas that drive that policy are probably the most important thing, those neoliberal priorities that shape the curriculum in terms of very narrow ways of thinking about school readiness, for example. So I do think that policymakers have a place within that, but I think what has happened is the balance has got skewed, and also the priorities driving the policymakers are such that other voices within that curriculum making process have been marginalised or often silenced.
Thank you. I do have some questions from our audience. I'm just going to have a look. So Julie asks, will paying attention to funds of knowledge / identity be all the more challenged by a curriculum that, in the words of the New Development Matters, is what we want children to learn?
Thank you for that, Julie. Yes, I think it will. I think that that some practitioners will manage to play the system and enable children's funds of knowledge to still take centre stage. But yes, I think it's something that concerns me, and why early childhood continues to be a place where we need to stand up and speak up, I think, for some of those concerns we've got. I'm sure that Nathan's going to be talking a bit more about that in his session next week. So yes, I think it is something that worries me, and I think it goes back as well to the quality and the nature of initial training and education for practitioners, and also continuing professional development, because practitioners need that ongoing support, and they need their own funds of knowledge to be able to work a funds of knowledge approach within some of the rather instrumental constraints that we've got within the English educational system, and that I think you're right, Julie, are probably going to become much more powerful forces in the future, potentially.
So Karen asks, did you find early years practitioners, teaching assistants who live in the same community as children and families understand or notice funds of knowledge in a different way to practitioners that perhaps lived beyond the community?
Oh, that's a great question, isn't it? Yeah, I didn't have time to say. Thank you for that, Karen. The setting where we worked, and we can name them actually because it was a collaborative project. It was Ellesmere Community Children's Centre, and Dr. Sharon Curtis, who is the head of centre, was a collaborative partner within the research. And Sharon Curtis has got a really interesting recruitment policy, really important recruitment policy, where she actively recruits from the local community. So nearly all of her team live within the community where that serves the centre, and so actually there weren't any practitioners that didn't live within that area, and that was really important, because it did mean that often the practitioners were able to interpret what children were doing in ways that me and Aderonke, the other researcher, were unable to do. So I think that's really crucial, and it sort of has got implications for how we recruit early years practitioners. Yeah.
So I've got quite a meaty question for you from Marco, who asks, what's your definition of curriculum?
Oh, well, gosh, I used to teach a whole module actually on what is curriculum. I sound like a name dropper here, but it's just come into my head. I've just written a piece of work with Helen Hedges actually, where we were talking about exactly this, because I think that my definition of curriculum blurs the boundaries between curriculum and pedagogy. And that's why I was saying that observation is kind of the fuel that drives that process. So for me, curriculum is about what children learn, but it's also about the how also comes in with it. Because if you have a dynamic curriculum, you can't really think about a dynamic curriculum without thinking about pedagogy. And ultimately, that the key ingredients within that approach to pedagogy are interactions and respectful relationships. So I can remember when I trained as a teacher, my Pat Broadhead, who was also my PhD supervisor, said to me that a curriculum is everything we do and say with children, actually. And that stayed with me. And I think I would still say that that's my definition of curriculum. For me, curriculum is much broader and more holistic than what we teach, if that makes sense.
So Joe asks, our policy making has become separated from theory and practice. So can movements like the new Birth to 5 framework bring back some equilibrium and activism within early childhood education?
Thank you, Joe. It would be great if it could, wouldn't it? I think it marks a really exciting time of possibilities, where you've got really a big critical mass of people coming together and saying, look, we want to explore different ways of thinking about curriculum, of thinking about pedagogy, of thinking about ultimately the purposes of early childhood. So I hope so. The optimist in me says I think that we could have really exciting times ahead. But I guess the realist in me also thinks that policy, I think, will continue to be shaped in the ways that we've seen it developing over the last few years. But the only way that we get change is through these small steps, isn't it? So I think we need to stay positive, and we need to think about, yeah, how exciting it is to be working in early childhood at the moment. I think potentially there could be some really interesting times ahead of us that hopefully will make a difference for children.
So Karen asks, how can we push back as teacher educators to enlarge the stage and enable observation to take centre stage rather than the key performers of planning and assessment?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Karen. At the moment, I don't work as a teacher educator, but I spent many years working at Sheffield Hallam and Leeds Beckett before I came to Sheffield, leading teacher education courses. And I'm very aware that for teacher educators, Ofsted exert a powerful influence on you, just the same as they do schools and settings. So I guess the only way that we do it is the same way that skilled teachers and practitioners do it, by kind of bringing these ideas in, by playing the system, playing the game. I'm trying to think of the paper that talks about this idea of playing the assessment game. But I guess that is the same with teacher educators, isn't it? That we ultimately, we all stand and build what we want for children on our principles and values. And when we've still got our principles and values, and if you're in agreement with me that observation is a really important part of early childhood that we kind of need to reclaim, I guess there are ways of bringing that into the experiences that student teachers and practitioners have. But again, I do acknowledge that it's really complex and it's really challenging, and that there's no easy answers.
I've just got an interesting comment from Kathy, who did her master's dissertation, and this is something that occurred to me as you were talking, focused on parent and practitioner, oh, it's disappeared. Sorry, parent and practitioner thoughts about superhero and weapon play. And I know certainly the nursery children I used to teach, no matter what you did with regards to gunplay, they would turn a number 7 into a gun. And while some practitioners thought that superhero play should be valued and included, none of the parents, and this is a similar experience to me, or practitioners thought that children's interest in pretend weapon play should be supported. And especially if we're thinking about funds of knowledge and children who perhaps have parents who are in the military or the police force, who will have those experiences. I thought that was a really interesting comment.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? I always remember those blocks that are sort of shaped like that, and children using them as guns. And then in a nursery where I worked, where there was a sort of zero tolerance policy on gunplay, suddenly they turned into hairdryers, and then you had your back to they turned back into guns again. So yeah, I think it's really tricky, isn't it? I think, first of all, it goes back to the importance of a community of inquiry where parents are part of that process as well. And often, and again, I think this goes back to this sort of accountability, this data-driven system. Often the only opportunities to talk with parents in depth about children's learning relate to the data. Whereas in actual fact, to talk about these really complex issues where people have very valid, very differing ideas, we need to create that safe space for dialogue, to be able to, for parents, children and practitioners to talk together. I also think, and again, if I'd have had a little bit longer, I talked too long at the beginning, I think, but when we think about that interest in play fighting, the way that practitioners respond to that might be very different to the way that practitioners respond, for example, to the interest in dinosaurs, but it can still be part of curriculum making. So, for example, if you think about practices like philosophy with children, philosophy for children, opportunities for children to think about some of the complexities of gunplay and what it feels like from different perspectives. I've seen some really good work done with that, actually, in a centre where I used to work. It wasn't my work, it was at colleagues. But that was a centre where there were very strong differing ideas within the practitioner team, let alone with the parents, about what should be done with gunplay. But one really skilled practitioner introduced some really lovely sort of experiences that drew in a sort of early years way on philosophy for children sort of approaches. You know, likewise, I mean, Lou Zippin talks about this idea of dark funds of knowledge. I wouldn't say that gunplay is a dark funds of knowledge at all, but at Ellesmere Children's Centre, there were children who belonged to families who were asylum seekers, who were seeking refuge in England. Some of those children had actually made the journey from their home countries themselves. So obviously for those children, they were often dealing with some really difficult experiences. And so funds of knowledge aren't always these light, fluffy things. And this again is where the skills of the profession, of the workforce, are so crucial in terms of knowing how those responses to children's funds of knowledge and their interests, both in the moment and in that sort of more sort of that bigger picture, are absolutely crucial. So I've kind of gone off piste a bit here, sorry Louise, but yeah, just recognising the complexity of particular interests relating to superhero and gunplay.
It is a fascinating area and like you say, full of complexities and things around death as well, and you know, those kind of things that children do experience. We've only got about 2 minutes left, so we have a very important question. This is going to be the last question, I'm afraid, although we do have others on the that I didn't get around to. Joe asks, how is your cat?
Oh, she's all right. Oh, do you know? Thank you, Joe. I was very worried actually because she's a bit of a sicky cat, and I thought, oh my God, she's going to be sick on me. So, but yeah, she's fine now. It was just a little bit of indigestion after her tea, Joe. She's asleep on my jumper next to me now.
Well, thank you so much, Liz, again for your presentation and again, you know, answering the questions. And I'm sorry to anyone who didn't read your question out, but it's been a really thought-provoking hour. And I'd just like to ask everybody just to hang around for 2 more seconds when we finished, because we do have another couple of questions for you. You know, thinking about how we run webinars and what you want to see as part of, you know, BERA and us being the conveners for the SIG. And to remind you again, we have Nathan's presentation next week on agency and activism, and then Nancy Stewart's presentation in 2 weeks' time. So hopefully we'll see you then. Thank you very much, everybody.